Hello everyone. Today's seminar, we're going to talk about the basics of permitting within the South Coast Air Quality Management District. Questions about permitting are very common. We get these questions all the time. And so we decided to put together this short seminar for you that will answer some of the questions regarding the basics of permitting, again, within the South Coast Air Quality Management District. So let's take a look at this. In this seminar, we're going to talk about four things. Number one, we're going to talk about why permits are needed. Number two, we're going to talk about a few general types of air permits. Number three, we're going to talk about the importance about complying with the permit conditions as noted on the face of your permit. And number four, we're going to talk about the basic components of a complete permit application. So number one, why are permits needed? Very simply, permits are needed to manage projects and to minimize the impacts to ambient air quality as a result of these projects. And in doing so, permits are a way to manage new sources of air pollution in a way that doesn't degrade current air quality. And in addition to that, very simply, permits are needed to comply with federal air quality laws and regulations. Not only federal air quality laws and regulations, but federal, state, and local air quality laws and regulations. And so on a very basic level, those are the two reasons why permits are needed in the first place. Now moving on to the second part of this seminar, now that we know why permits are needed in the first place, let's talk about the three general types of air permits. The first type of air permit is a pre-construction permit. And a pre-construction permit simply allows the holder to construct a piece of equipment that requires an air permit. Now, the second type of air permit is an operating permit, which allows the holder to operate the piece of equipment. And then number three, you have Title V operating permits or federal operating permits. And these permits are required by the Federal Clean Air Act. And so let's take a look at these three types of permits in a little bit more detail. So let's start with the pre-construction permits. And remember that permits are required by air quality laws and regulations. Now, like I said earlier, the pre-construction permit allows the holder to simply construct a piece of equipment. Now, in the South Coast Air Quality Management District, Rule 201 simply outlines when a piece of equipment will need a permit. Rule 201 is very simple. I'm just going to read out loud here the first sentence. And it says that a person shall not build, erect, install, alter, or replace any equipment or agricultural permit unit, the use of which may cause the issuance of air contaminants, or the use of which may eliminate, reduce, or control the issuance of air contaminants without first obtaining written authorization for such construction from the executive officer. Now, when looking at Rule 201, the last piece about obtaining written authorization is very important because that written authorization is the permit itself. Now, there are exemptions to Rule 201, or in other words, there are exemptions to permitting, and the exemptions are outlined in Rule 219. Now, in determining the applicability of a piece of equipment to permitting, you first want to look at Rule 201, and then you will want to look at Rule 219, and then you want to look at the third rule, which actually isn't presented here on the slide, but you will also want to look at the registration requirements under Rule 222. When it comes to permitting, each of the California's 35 air districts will have its own rules for permitting because the rules within each air district are dependent on whether or not the area meets the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. In other words, if an area has poor air quality, then you can expect that the air quality regulations in that area to be more stringent when compared to an area that does meet the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. In other words, the reason why the AQMD's regulations are so stringent and the air permitting rules here are so stringent is simply because of the nature of the air quality that's here in Southern California. And more specifically, Southern California's air does not meet certain national ambient air quality standards. And so because of that, the air quality rules are stringent to allow the basin in enough time or to control enough emissions within the basin to the point where we can ultimately one day in the future obtain or attain the national ambient air quality standards. Like I said earlier, permits need to be in hand before construction can take place. And in terms of a timeline, it can take anywhere between 6 to 12 months or more to get an air permit. And so you want to be sure that you incorporate this timeline into your overall project so that your expectations with respect to getting a permit or how long it may take to get a permit are realistic. So let's look at the second type of permit, and it's called an operating permit. And like I said earlier, the operating permit simply allows the holder to operate a piece of equipment. Now, similar to construction permits, an operating permit must be in hand prior to operating the equipment. And when it comes to permit conditions, both construction permits and operating permits will have conditions listed on the face of the permit. And it's important to understand or even remember that the conditions noted on the face of a permit must be followed and met at all times. If it appears on the face of the permit, you must comply with those conditions at all times. And if you don't, then you can run into problems. Now, some of these conditions can limit operation, can limit the amount of emissions or the types of emissions that are allowed to be emitted from your piece of equipment, or the conditions may even require monitoring, reporting, and record keeping. And lastly, sometimes permit conditions may require emission testing prior to the issuance of the final permit. So you want to be sure that you look at all the conditions on the face of your permit and you assess whether or not, or you take an assessment or you complete an assessment of whether or not it is possible to comply with all of the conditions as noted on the face of your permit. Lastly, the third kind of permit that we're going to talk about here in this seminar is a Title V permit. A Title V permit is required by the Federal Clean Air Act, or more specifically, Title V of the Federal Clean Air Act. And the Title V permit, by design, was meant to centralize all of the requirements needed for a facility to comply with the Clean Air Act in one document. So what I mean by that is that previously or before Title V, permit requirements were summarized or stated on individual permits and scattered throughout multiple documents. When Title V came along, Title V centralized all of these requirements and permits into a central document called the facility permit. And the issuance of a facility permit was meant to increase enforceability as well as ease in trying to meet all of the air quality requirements issued by a specific regulatory agency. Now, with respect to Title V permits, these permits are typically issued to larger facilities, and the applicability depends on the amount of air emissions, among other things, but generally, applicability to the Title V program is simply based on the amount of air emissions coming out of your facility. Now, some of the requirements of the Title V program include collecting data from your process, keeping records of these data, as well as preparing and submitting reports of the data. Now, these reports also must include instances of non-compliance and or deviations. And largely, the process of collecting data, maintaining reports, and submitting reports is a common theme among air quality regulation, and this theme is commonly referred to as the MRR, or Monitoring, Reporting, and Record Keeping Scheme, Here at Envera Consulting, we simply call this the compliance trifecta because it includes 3 components. So let's talk about the the third section, not the last section, there's actually a 4th section, but we're talking about the 3rd section of this seminar. We'll talk about compliance with permits. Now, like I said before, permits will have conditions listed on the face of them, and it's important that you follow the conditions of the permit at all times. Now, it may seem simple, but you'll be actually surprised at how many times there are errors noted on the face of the permit. And the fact that there is an error on the face of the permit can cause a lot of problems because you have to comply with the conditions as noted on the face of your permit. Therefore, you want to check and double check all the conditions carefully. And you really want to ask the question, can compliance be achieved as stated on the face of the permit? Ultimately, you want to look at all the conditions and the descriptions to be sure that the equipment is installed and operating as noted in the permit condition or permit application. And you also want to look to see if there are any differences in what is in the permit application or what is on the permit when compared to how things are actually done in the field. Very common problem is that what we told the air district in the application and what is on the conditions noted on the face of the permit can be very different than what is actually occurring out in the field. So you want to be sure that they're consistent. And so lastly, let's look at the 4th section of the seminar where we're talking about the basic components of an air permit. Now, an air permit contains 3 components. Number 1, there's forms. And typically there are 4 types of forms that are required. This is a 400A, which is the basic permitting form that will need to be submitted with all of your permit applications. This is a Form 400 CEQA that is also necessary when submitting permit applications. And then this is a Form 400E. Now, Form 400E, or this is an example of a Form 400E. Form 400E is actually a group of forms that are organized by equipment type. And when filling out Form 400E, you'll have to go through all the forms and select the one that describes your equipment and then fill out the form accordingly. The data that goes on a Form 400E is related to equipment and provides the district with very specific information about the equipment being permitted. This is a Form 500, and a Form 500 will be needed if you're a Title V facility. And again, the Form 500 is a group of forms, and the specific type of 500 series form that's needed will depend on the type of permit that you're applying for, but 500 series forms are only needed for Title V facilities. Now, the second component of the permit application are the fees. Now, when it comes to fees, the fees or the amount of fees that you will need to pay to process your permit application depend on the type of equipment and the situation that you're in. The fees can be higher or lower depending on the situation. So as an example, if you're applying for a permit after you install the piece of equipment, you can expect to pay higher fees. On the other hand, if you're permitting multiple pieces of identical equipment, then you can actually apply for a discount which will lower the fees. So in general, there are a number of fee modifiers that are outlined in Rule 301 that you can take advantage of when preparing your permit application that will modify your fees either upward or downward depending on the situation. Now, the last component of the permit application is the engineering evaluation. And this is probably the most important part of the application. And when it comes to preparing this engineering evaluation, this evaluation actually is comprised of 10 elements. And it's important to note that the data that you provide within your engineering evaluation will be used by the air district to determine if a piece of equipment or the piece of equipment that you want permitted can be constructed and operated in compliance with all the rules and regulations of the air district that are applicable to this piece of equipment. And so, like I said, there are 10 components of an engineering evaluation. We're going to talk briefly about the 10. Number 1 is a facility introduction. For the facility introduction, you just want to talk about the general information about the facility. The name, who owns it, what is the mailing address, what's the address of the equipment, and so forth. Somewhat general. In number 2, you want to talk about the equipment description. And the AQMD has a very specific way of writing equipment descriptions, and this specific way of writing equipment descriptions is needed because this is how the equipment will be described in the face of your permit. And so you want to be sure that your equipment description is correct because it's going to land up on the face of your permit. And in addition to this specific way of writing or describing your piece of equipment, you want to generally describe your piece of equipment. But regardless, you should have both. You should have the general description of what is this piece of equipment, and then you also want to have the AQMD specific equipment description. Both of those you would want to include as part of component 2 here. Number 3 is where you want to talk about the process. Things that you can include for your process description are, what does the process make? Is this a new or existing process? What are the emission points from the process? Are there any types of pollutants emitted from the process? Are there any control devices, and so forth? More specifically, what you want to do is you want to describe the process that this piece of equipment will serve. Sometimes a single piece of equipment will fit into a larger process. Sometimes that piece of equipment will be the entire process. Whatever the case, you want to explain it here in section 3. Number 4, you want to talk about the permitting history. And it's simply the history of permitting or AQMD permitting at that facility. You can talk about when were the first permits issued? When were the most recent permits issued? Have there been any compliance issues related to this facility in the past? So give the AQMD a little bit of history about the facility that you're permitting. Number 5 is where you want to talk about the sources of your emissions data. Now, as part of your application, you're going to have to calculate emissions from this equipment, and you're going to want to do that accurately. And so while the emission calculations are actually in section 6, in section 5, you want to talk about the sources or where you will get the data to calculate the emissions in your permit application. Will you be calculating emissions from a source test? Will you be using a database of emission factors? Will you be using rule-specific limits, maybe a manufacturer's guarantee? Whatever the case, you want to describe the data in section 5. Now in section 6, you will want to use the data that you described in section 5 and then use the data to calculate the 8 emission rates for the criteria pollutants as well as the 3 emission rates for the toxics. Now, for the 8 emission rates for the criteria pollutants, I'm just going to read them here. You want to calculate the average hourly uncontrolled, the average hourly controlled, the maximum hourly controlled, the maximum hourly uncontrolled, the maximum daily controlled, the maximum daily uncontrolled, the 30-day average emissions, as well as the annual average emissions. And so those are the 8 emission rates needed for the criteria pollutants. In addition to that, for the toxics, you're going to want to calculate the maximum hourly uncontrolled, the maximum hourly controlled, and then the maximum annual controlled emissions from your piece of equipment. And so again, those are the 8 emission rates, actually the 11 emission rates that you'll need to calculate within your permit application. And again, the data that are used to calculate those 11 rates come from the sources that you described in section 5. Number 7 is a rule analysis. This is also a major component of the engineering evaluation because it requires you to identify all the rules that apply to this piece of equipment. Now, if you go to the AQMD's rule book, there's a lot of rules in it. But part of your application requires you to go through all the rules, pick out the ones that apply, and then actually describe how you will achieve compliance with all of those rules. You're going to actually want to understand the requirements, and then how are you going to meet those requirements within your facility. Number 8, you'll have to do a health risk assessment. Now, based on the 3 toxic rates that you calculated in section 6, you'll use those emission rates to do a health risk assessment. And the AQMD has actually put together a pretty comprehensive guide on how to complete a health risk assessment for permitting. So number 8 is the completion of a health risk assessment. Number 9 is where you want to draft permit conditions that you want to see in your permit. Like I said earlier, the AQMD will impose conditions on every single permit. And as a whole, you need to comply with these permit conditions at all times. Now again, these permit conditions, or the drafting of these permit conditions, need to be done in a way that you ensure the AQMD that this piece of equipment will operate in compliance with all the rules and regulations of the air district. Now when drafting these permit conditions, there are 2 things to keep in mind. Number 1, consider the points that you made when you went through your rule evaluation in section 6. If you state specific actions that you're going to do to ensure compliance with the rules you identified in section 6, then draft a permit condition to ensure or to make the AQMD comfortable that, yes, this is what we're going to do and compliance will be achieved. If you're going to operate the equipment within a certain range of operating conditions, you want to note that. You can include set points, monitoring frequencies, and all that kind of stuff. In addition, when drafting these permit conditions, be sure that these conditions are actually possible to comply with. Don't just draft permit conditions for the sake of drafting permit conditions, because you can land up in, a whole sea of problems because those conditions can be enforced on your permit. As a permit holder, your conditions need to be practical because it's your duty and responsibility to comply at all times. Now, before closing on this 9th section of the evaluation, I just want to note that if you're going to keep records, be sure that maintaining those records and generating those records are not going to be a problem. If you're going to propose to monitor a parameter, be sure that the monitor equipment is already installed or can be installed without a problem. Whatever the case, you just want to be thinking ahead of how compliance with these draft permit conditions will be demonstrated. And then lastly, number 10, you want to make a recommendation to the AQMD to issue the permit. The recommendation is basically a final push or the final request to the AQMD that, yes, if you grant this permit, we will operate this piece of equipment in compliance with all the rules and regulations of the air district. Again, you want to make a strong case that compliance will be achieved. And it's best to back up that recommendation using specific examples or methods that you've identified in the rule analysis or drafting your permit condition. So as we start to close, let's summarize what we talked about. So again, air permits are needed to enforce air quality laws and regulations, in addition to managing projects and to minimize the impacts to ambient air quality as a result of building new pieces of equipment that emit air contaminants. In general, we talked about the 3 types of air permits. Number 1, you have the pre-construction permit, which allows you to construct a piece of equipment. Number 2, you'll have the operating permit, which allows you to operate that piece of equipment. We also talked about the federal operating permit, or the Title V permit, which is typically issued to larger facilities and increases the enforceability of the Federal Clean Air Act. Now, when it comes to these permits, compliance with the conditions noted on your permit must be met at all times. And if not, you could potentially find yourself into a sea of problems that could potentially turn into legal issues. And then lastly, we talked about the components of a complete permit application, which are the forms, the fees, and an engineering evaluation. And then we also talked about the fact that an engineering evaluation has 10 components. And we also talked about the importance of that engineering evaluation because the data that is provided or contained within that document will be used by the air district to make an assessment of whether or not the piece of equipment being permitted can be constructed or operated within the compliance with all the applicable rules of the air district. So there you have it. It's a very basic seminar about permitting within the AQMD. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. My contact information is here. I also encourage you to stop by our website at enveraconsulting.com. There you can find our growing content library of articles and resources that are designed to help you through all of California's air quality regulations. And so we have a lot of material on our website to help you do that. Again, thank you for your time. Good day.